Last week, I talked about why growth stage founders sometimes get legally stuck, even when the business itself is strong. Today, I want to show you one of the biggest structural reasons it happens. I've seen companies with real momentum lose deals before price was ever discussed, and the founder had no idea why. Revenue was growing, investors were interested, and everyone assumed the deal would come together. And then the process slowed down and eventually died. Not because the business wasn't strong, but because the capital structure underneath the company couldn't support the deal. I've been thinking about a founder I've worked with for several years as I say this. Great business, strong vision, real momentum. But as the company grew, a few early decisions quietly shaped what the company could and couldn't do later. And none of those decisions looked like mistakes at the time. Let me walk you through 4 places this usually shows up. Fourth, raising just enough capital and no more. Early on, this company underestimated how much capital it would take to build the business they envisioned. So instead of raising enough to move confidently into the next stage, they kept financing through bridge structures. A bridge here, another short-term loan there. Each one solved the immediate problem, but over time, the company ended up financing itself reactively instead of strategically. What should have been a clean next phase of capitalization became a series of patches layered on top of each other. And once capital structures start layering like that, every new investor has to entangle what came before. That's when deals start slowing down. Third, misaligned investor rights and expectations. Early investment terms often feel reasonable when a company is young. Anti-dilution protections, liquidation rights, liquidation preferences, consent rights. But those terms were written for the company as it existed then and not the company it would become. In this case, some of the original investor provisions were different, anticipating a different investor base than the one that actually developed. Those investors never materialized, but the provisions stayed. So today, relatively routine decisions, including additional financing, often require going back to early investors for approval. The founder moves quickly, but the documents don't. And that kind of friction becomes very visible when new investors start evaluating the company. Second, control and decision-making. Founders tend to focus on ownership percentages, but buyers and investors care just as much about who actually controls the company. In this situation, the governance structure made decision-making more complicated than it needed to be. The founder was the visionary behind the company and also one of the largest lenders keeping the business moving. But because the governance structure flexibility was limited, that kind of structure might work when a company is small. But when the company starts scaling, it becomes a constraint. And investors notice that immediately. And the biggest issue I see in situations like this is early equity mechanics. Early in the life of this company, meaningful equity was granted to people who were believed to be critical to the business. At that stage, no one really knew who would ultimately prove essential. Some of those people eventually left, and some were fired. Others simply didn't end up being central to the company's growth. But because the equity hadn't been structured with strong vesting schedules, employment agreements, and repurchase rights, those ownership positions remained. And when equity issues surfaced during diligence, missed 83B elections, improperly issued equity, or unclear ownership records, the fixes are rarely simple. They can trigger tax exposure, ownership disputes, and serious complications right when momentum matters most. Here's the reality most founders don't hear early enough. Once structural issues show up in diligence, leverage erodes quickly. Options narrow, and the founder isn't choosing the best option anymore. They're choosing the least painful one. This isn't about raising more or less capital. It's about raising capital the right way. If you're preparing for growth, a financing, or an eventual exit, and you haven't pressure tested your capital structure, cap table, or equity mechanics since the early days, that's worth doing now while you still have choices. Because valuation gets all the attention, but structure is what determines whether a deal happens at all. We've put together a deal readiness checklist that walks through the key structural issues founders should review before a deal is on the line. Click the link in the bio and download it. It's a simple step that can protect a lot of value.